All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here, even though just trying to keep us on schedule. So I'm Jonathan Sheehan in the history department and co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. Welcome, everybody. I'd like you to welcome especially our speaker for today, Daniel Hershenzon, somebody I've known since we were both a lot younger. I think I met you my first few days when I was teaching at the University of Michigan. He's as a graduate student, and he's, I would say, really kind of my first and most successful of my graduate students from back in those days. He's gone on to have a wonderful career. So since 2014, Daniel Hershenzon has been teaching at the University of Connecticut. He's now associate professor in the Department of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages there. He has been widely published. This we're going to hear today is from a new book that just came out in 2018 from University of Pennsylvania Press called The Captive Sea, Slavery, Communication, and Commerce in Early Modern Spain and the Mediterranean. Got lots of interesting and important articles in places that we would all like to put articles, like Past and Present and Journal of Early Modern History. He's also won tons of different prizes from the NEH and varieties of other ones that I could list. The Max Weber Fellowship at the EUI, and most happily right now, he just received 2 fellowships for the next 2 years from the Institute for Advanced Study and the ACLS Burkhardt. So he's currently at the beginning of a long period of relaxed research on a new project, which we're not going to hear about today. But which, if you'd like to ask him about questions or afterwards come up and talk to him, it's also extremely interesting. So I hope you join me in welcoming Daniel Hershenzon to Berkeley.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the Center for the Study of Religion and everybody for being here. I'll just start. So throughout the 17th century, a wide range of individuals, institutions, and networks dealt with the trafficking of people, capturing, enslaving, smuggling, and ransoming across and beyond the borders of Spain's Mediterranean territories, Ottoman Algiers, and Morocco. According to a recent estimation, around or more than 3 million Muslims and Christians were taken captive and enslaved between 1450 and 1850. Only a small number managed to obtain release through compensation, swapping, or flight. Rulers and captives and ransomers together became the chief actors in a system stimulated by maritime violence. My talk today is taken from my just published book that Jonathan mentioned, The Captive Sea, where I explore this historical scene in terms of a region formation process, namely the ways in which Mediterranean practices, connections, and relations across the sea became more intense, creating a regional unity in terms of, despite religious and political rivalry. In the book, I argue that ransom-related mechanisms associated with the captivities of Christians and Muslims shaped the Mediterranean as an integrated region. I show that despite confessional differences and geographical distance, the life of Muslims and Christian captives were interrelated and interdependent. And I show how these captivities were linked through the workings of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim merchants, church institutions, and Mediterranean rulers, Algerian pashas, Moroccan sultans, and Spanish kings. All of these people, all these actors negotiated ransom procedures, captives' value, and Mediterranean mobility patterns, interacting through an array of texts that captives created and circulated. And one thing that, and one argument about which I'm not going to speak today is that in the Mediterranean, slavery was not only a system of bondage, but also a system of communication. My talk today looks at the capture of a young Algerian girl and the imprisonment in Algiers of 3 Spanish friars sent to ransom Spanish captives. And analyzing their stories, I'm going to advance 3 related arguments. Skipped a few slides, you see. The first is methodological. I argue that we need to understand ransom as a transnational, or to avoid anachronisms, trans-imperial political economy, the result of the reciprocal influences of political, society, and religion and economy. And by analyzing Ransom in terms of political economy, I repoliticize and resocialize an activity that has recently been analyzed in strictly economic and political terms. This kind of, or in strictly economic and national terms, sorry. This kind of analysis also allows me to challenge Mediterranean historiography. And one of the main stories that we historians tell ourselves about the early modern Mediterranean, a thesis known as the Northern Invasion, namely the idea that at the turn of the 16th century, Dutch, English, French invaded the Mediterranean, transforming it from a space dominated by religious violence and imperial enmity into a market zone where nation states competed one against the other. So basically it's a story of modernization. I'm going to show the enduring importance of sociologics, of religious mechanisms and political negotiations long after the Northern Invasion, and insofar as modernization is understood as the economizing and nationalizing of the sea, we don't see that happening in this period at least. And that leads me to my third argument, also related to the Northern Invasion, which implies that from the turn of the 17th century, Europe began shaping the Mediterranean and by extension, Muslim North Africa, and the cross-maritime interactions that I explore, I suggest, force us to rethink early modern Europe and its others. They also reveal how trans-imperial maritime networks covering the Western Mediterranean continue to shape Spanish and by extension European seemingly bounded territorial identities. Ultimately, I suggest that in order to understand early modern Spain and Europe, we need to turn our attention back to the Mediterranean. Three arguments then. And the rest of this talk is divided in three acts. The first explores the fine power balance among our main protagonists. So we have the Christian and Muslim captives, Christian ecclesiastic ransom institutions, Muslim and Jewish merchants from North Africa, and Christian merchants mostly from Spain, and finally Mediterranean rulers. The second act focuses on a moment of crisis in that balance of power. The third and final examines how that moment led to the restructuring of relations between political, economic, and religious actors. In 1608, a 13-year-old Algerian named Fatima was taken captive by the Genoese fleet and sold to slavery in Livorno to a Jewish couple who assisted her to send the word back home to Algiers. And her father, Mohamed Adja, a Janissary, a soldier of the Ottoman militia, commissioned a Corsican merchant who traded with Algiers on a regular basis to ransom his daughter and return her to the city. The Corsican left to Livorno, found Fatima, paid a ransom fee, and boarded the ship to Algiers together with the girl. Now, a year later, I'm turning to a different story, in early March 1609, Bernardo de Monroy and two other members of the Trinitarian order, charged with redeeming captives from the Maghreb, left Valencia in western Spain, heading to Algiers. And I have slides of all that, I just forget about it. They arrived on April 1st, and by mid-May, they had ransomed 130 Spaniards and were ready to return to Spain. Now, these stories present us with two options that captives could pursue in order to advance their liberty. The first was to count on the redeeming labor of either Mercedarians or the Trinitarians, two religious orders that were established at the turn of the 13th century to redeem captives from Islam, from the Muslim world. In the early modern period, they are active in Iberia, in France, in parts of Italy, and they also have an Ethiopian separate history. The other option was to contact either Christian merchants or Jews and Muslims from North Africa. And the relations between redeeming friars, ransoming merchants, the Spanish king, and Maghrebi political actors primarily took shape in the last quarter of the 16th century after Philip II negotiated a truce with the Ottomans in 1581, giving up on the North African colonial agenda. Following the agreement, corsairs, the word we use in the Mediterranean to refer to privateers, replaced large imperial fleets. Captive taking became extremely common, independent of spectacular maritime clashes such as Lepanto, and the number of captives increased. And in response, the Spanish king tightened its regulation of the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, increasing the funds it dispensed them for ransom, and financing ransom meant dictating a ransom agenda, deciding who was going to be redeemed. The king was mostly interested in redeeming soldiers, which he could reassign to military service, rather than, for example, the old and the sick. The king also bureaucratized ransom procedures, making the friars apply for a royal permission to set expeditions for the Maghreb and for passports to travel to North Africa. And by transforming ransom into an imperially sanctioned enterprise, the monarch strengthened its royal control of the orders, centralized royal power, increased the number of Spaniards that were redeemed, and further the construction of the king's image as a devout Catholic, taking care of Catholic in danger of conversion to Islam in the context of captivity. Now, this process of bureaucratization was one that also involved North African actors. Algerian pashas, Moroccan sultans also participated in it because they were the ones issuing the passports. The passports were the number and identity of captives that had to be redeemed was stipulated. In this way, North African rulers could make the friars first buy the captives they own, then the captives of their clients. And the orders often found themselves forced to buy captives in which they took no interest, for example, Protestants, in order to buy the one they desired. The friars also shared the market with Iberian merchants and North African Jews and Muslims. And friars and merchants, they both sought to liberate captives, but they framed the work in completely different terms. When ecclesiastics purchased captives, they were redeeming souls in danger of conversion to Islam. And in this sense, their activity served a wider reciprocal logic. Reciprocity understood here as a sense of obligation among community members. As Christians, they rescued fellow Christians, advancing the salvation of these members of their confessional community. Economic exchange and profit, on the other hand, formed the dominant aspect in the ransom activity of merchants, for whom ransom was mainly a way of legitimating trade with North Africa. And their involvement in the ransom market placed them in competition with the friars, with the latter occasionally complaining to the crown that the merchants were abusing the royal trading license at the expense of captives. So let me take a step back from the history to the historiography. And the picture as I delineated it so far, two kinds of factors, friars and merchants, redeemers and ransomers, is very much in sync with how scholars of piracy and ransom have tended to focus either on royal ecclesiastic ransom institutions or more recently on commercial networks, small-scale networks, ransom networks. And the decision to study these modes of ransom in isolation carries interpretative and empirical consequences. An institutional approach that focuses exclusively on church institutions imagines the Middle Sea as a forgotten frontier, which is another historiographic construct that historians use to imagine the early modern Mediterranean, the early modern Western Mediterranean, sharply dividing Islam and Christianity. It's a perspective that favors the nation or religion as its units of analysis, failing to account for the ways in which Spanish ransom agendas were shaped in response to pressures from North Africa, from merchants. And the result is that the attempts of multiple actors just disappear, and the sea is portrayed as dominated by religious violence separating two religious blocks. The Mediterranean re-emerges as a space defined by exchange when scholars focus on ransom intermediaries, and in addition to tell us a great deal about insurance cost, about transaction cost, about credit mechanism, this perspective has the merit of avoiding reading ransom and captivity in terms of a trans-historical clash between Christianity and Islam. And yet, it neglects, this perspective too neglects the continuous importance, or not too, but this perspective neglects the importance of religion, politics, and society, and the corrective emphasis on merchants and exchange at the expense of church institutions divorces two kinds of actors that constantly collaborated and competed. And from a broader perspective, this scholarly divide maps into the larger debate in Mediterranean historiography about the northern invasion. Which, as I mentioned again, it's the idea that at the turn of the 17th century, the sea was modernized, turning into an economic sphere. Against this perspective, I'm seeking to understand human trafficking by incorporating local and imperial actors, accounting for the role of religion and other factors shaping the market. Let's go back to the history and continue to examine the nature of the relations between friars, merchants, and rulers. I mentioned that the friars competed against Christian merchants, but they often collaborated with Jews and Muslims from North Africa. And there were several reasons to that. First, North African merchants dominated the local languages, Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, perhaps Berber languages. Second, they had contacts in the region. Third, as important, after 1492 and 1609, the expulsion of the Jews and later the expulsion of the Moriscos, the descendants of the Spanish Muslims, these groups had limited access to Spain. They couldn't compete against the orders. They couldn't subvert the image of themselves that the orders were shaping at that time. Jews and Muslims served the friars as interpreters, innkeepers, and sellers of captives, but they also played a key role in the cross-regional economy of ransom. Occasionally, they would buy captives in one place, in Algiers, for example, and travel hundreds of miles with them, west to Tetuan or to other cities in Morocco. And there they sold them to the friar. And this delivery service was extremely convenient for the friars who didn't frequent North African cities more than once in every 3 years on average. In the price of a single expedition to one city, they could ransom captives from a number of cities. Maghrebi authorities were a lot less enthusiastic about this trans-regional trade, which they believed transpired at their expense. And they tried to prevent it. Their interest was to have a well-regulated market with the friars who couldn't speak the languages, who didn't have the contacts, coming there, buying their captives, buying the captives of their clients. It was a way of claiming sovereignty, of greasing social networks, and of making money. And the Algerian Divan, the governing council, accused these merchants for the loss of revenues that the Algerian authorities had suffered. So the same reason that made Jews favorite, desirable allies for the orders, transformed them into competitors of the Pasha. And this collaboration between friars and local merchants was a routine matter. And the fact that it was such suggests that either the Divan failed to regulate it, or that it came to accept limited involvement of other actors in this market. How did all this look from Spain? I mean, after all, we are talking about collaboration between Spanish king and Jews and Muslims previously expelled from Spain. Well, the king knew exactly how important, especially Jewish intermediaries, were to the Spanish colonies in North Africa, where they served as intermediaries, as spies, as enslavers. So the king came to accept tacitly this collaboration, despite the fact that we're talking about two groups that in theory are not allowed to set foot on Spanish soil in the period. So we have two competing agendas of interaction and exchange. Tacitly collaborating with intermediaries rather than negotiating directly with the Algerians seemed to be the preferred model for the Spanish king, and this was despite the fact that working with merchants made ransom more expensive. Again, this as far as the Spanish king was concerned, this was not an economic activity. This was an act of redeeming souls. And on the other hand, the Algerians, together with the Moroccans, tried to cartelize ransom, preferring face-to-face or as direct as possible interaction and exchange that would have allowed them to distribute favors and reassert political power. Now, as much as these agendas differed, none of the parties felt an acute need to impose their model. Merchants on the one hand and friars on the other were not thought to be mutually exclusive options, but rather complementary ones. The status quo changed at the beginning of the second decade of the 17th century. And I'm moving to the second part of the lecture, and it's time to go back to Fatima. When we last left her, she was on her way back to Algiers to reunite with her family. Unfortunately, a short time after leaving Livorno, the ship stopped in Calvi, a port town in northwest Corsica, then under the dominion of the Genoese Republic, itself a Spanish satellite from 1528. And there, 13-year-old Fatima was forced to convert to Christianity and was baptized as Madalena. Seeing that the bishop would not let him take Madalena to Algiers, the Corsican merchant left to deliver the unfortunate news. Furious, Aja, Fatima's father, went to the divan and demanded redress. And in response, on May 13th, minutes before the Trinitarians and the captives they had ransomed boarded their ships, they were detained on the orders of the divan. Aja and the divan demanded the return of Aja's daughter in exchange for the Trinitarians and the ransomed captives. In the following years, a number of attempts to resolve the affair were negotiated amongst the Spanish king, the Spanish nobility, North African Jews, subjects of the Spanish king, Algerian pashas, and even the Ottoman Sultan, all of whom were interested in bringing the affair to an end, but they all failed. Fatima never returned home, and the Trinitarians died in their prison cells in Algiers. Now, this is a failure, and we historians, we owe so much to failures. I mean, we can't really work without them. So what do we learn from this failure? The Spaniards' inability to imagine the exchange of Madalena after her conversion reveals the significance of conversion in this system. Scholars have noted that captives' value was the result of factors such as age, status, wealth, gender, the imagined ability of captives' kin to pay ransom. But this account ignores the fact that the object of exchange, captives, were also vulnerable to manipulation of others and capable of manipulating their own value in ways that made them inalienable or decommodified. By converting or being converted, Fatima Madalena entered a new religious value regime from which her father could not redeem her despite his political power. She was now a member of a confessional community protected or trapped, depending on your perspective, by her co-religionists. The political economy of ransom was based on violent mechanisms for the insertion of people into exchange networks, but it allowed for complementary procedures for the removal of victims from the system into reciprocity-based networks. Conversion in this context was a mechanism making commodities inalienable. The system efficiency was predicated upon the membership of the human commodities in question in distinct confessional communities. the unique commodity that slaves were, at once objects and subjects, commodities that function as a religious boundary marker, that nature of them then points out the limits of these commercial networks and of an economizing perspective to study this topic. But Algiers was also responsible for failing to resolve the affair. And we see that when we look at the power struggles between the Pasha and the Aga, the captain of the Janissary militia. And their disagreement reveals both a communal logic similar to the one that was at the basis of the activity of the Friars, and political tensions external to Fatima's conversion. On the surface, it seems as if the source of debate was the salaries of the Janissaries, which the Pasha was responsible to pay, but often had difficulties in finding the funds. The archival records, however, reveals repeated discussions that tied the payment of the soldiers' salaries to the demand for Fatima's release. In response to complaints of the Janissaries about a delay in satisfying the wages, and this happened several times over a few months, the Pasha replied that he cannot pay them before they had freed the detained Trinitarians and allowed for a renewal of commerce in captives. The Pasha was seeking to retrieve the status quo and have the Friars return to Algiers. In contrast, the Janissaries operated like guild member protecting one of their members, Aja, Fatima's father. Their behavior was based again on the same logic of the kind that drove the Friars to redeem Christians or prevented the swapping of Fatima Magdalena for the Trinitarians. Only in this instance, reciprocity was predicated upon a professional fraternity and not a confessional group. And this tension also demonstrates the complexity of the political game, because we tend to imagine Mediterranean affairs, Mediterranean tensions in this context as sharply divided between the Muslim group and the Christian group. But when we look at the two coalitions that we have here, we have one coalition formed by the Spanish king, the Ottoman Sultan, and the Algerian Pasha, and another coalition, or it's not exactly a coalition, but another group formed by Janissaries, Christians who were forced to convert to Islam from different places. So it's really, the dynamic here cannot be mapped into a sharp religious divide. Let me turn to the third part of the talk. After the arrest of the Trinitarians, Philip III formalized the collaboration between the Friars and North African Jews and Muslims, transforming the latter into imperially sanctioned ransom agents. When the king heard of the arrest, he ordered a halt on all ransom expeditions to Algiers. But obviously, Algerians continued to capture Spaniards. So at some point, the Friars were looking for a way to circumvent the prohibition. They petitioned the king to commission Jews and Muslims in Tetuan that would ransom all captives from Algiers, bring them to Tetuan, and sell them to the Friars. The king issued the permission. Such petitions were resubmitted and issues were reissued. The Mercedarians did not return to Algiers until 1627, and the Trinitarians returned there only after 1652. So for several decades, a ransom of Spaniards from Algiers was outsourced. Now, what were the implications of these changes? By commissioning non-Habsburg subjects to execute the work of the Friars, the crown obviated the inherent risk of sending the orders to Algiers, and yet ransomed its subjects. Moreover, in compelling the orders to apply for a license for a procedure that deviated from the crown's formal instructions, the king reaffirmed and strengthened his control over the orders. In this sense, this affair illuminates the complexity of processes of political centralization in early modern Spain, in early modern imperial Spain. The crown's policy proves that state formation, centralization, and bureaucratization processes were often predicated upon the externalization of power and decentralization. Moreover, in this case, decentralization involved former subjects previously expelled who were now considered residents of enemy polities. Not only the political economy of ransom then was shaped by political processes, but in turn it weighed on state-making processes. By repeatedly guaranteeing such permits, the Catholic king increasingly relied on non-Spaniards who were not even Catholics for rescuing his subjects' bodies and saving their souls. Therefore, the increase of royal involvement in ransom, a policy geared to rescue as many Spanish subjects as possible, saving Christian souls in danger, and constructing a Catholic image of the monarchy, not only entailed a decentralization of political power, but also subverted royal ideologies. To redeem Christians from the Islamic world, the king had to re-establish new bonds and working relations with the symbolic arch-enemies of Spain, Jews and Muslims, precisely at the time when Philip III was expelling the Moriscos, the descendants of the Spanish Muslims. Once North African merchants were formally charged with ransoming Spaniards, they came to control a greater portion of the ransom market. But despite the fact that the royal decree increased the volume of captives trafficked by Muslim Jewish networks, it was the initial vibrancy and potency of the networks that allowed the king to suspend redemptive expeditions to Algiers. The friars expressed their discomfort from this new situation, from the growing influence of North African Jews and Muslims. One Mercedarian wrote in 1618, and I quote, "It does not seem advisable, nor will it ever be, that the redemptions be executed by intermediaries, especially not by Jews," end of quote. Nevertheless, he knew that he and his friends had no choice. They had to rely on the activity of these merchants. The authorities in Tetuan and Algiers were also dissatisfied with the growing influence of these merchants. From a Moroccan perspective, the Algerians were taking over their share of the ransom market, and indeed we see that. And the same concerns the Moroccans. In several times over the rest of the second decade of the 17th century, Mercedarians arrived in Tetuan, planning to commission local merchants to ransom captives from Algiers, but they faced fierce opposition of the local governor. Eventually, local Jews negotiated some kind of compromise according to which part of the funds were spent on local captives, another part of the funds was spent on captives from Algiers. The Algerians became more active in attempting to exclude local merchants from the ransom markets too. In 1614, for example, they caught and executed a Muslim merchant who left Algiers with 33 Christian captives he had intended to sell to the Friars in Tetuan. And they did everything they could from that point to eliminate such collaboration. Spanish reliance on Maghrebi Jews and Muslims then compelled Algerians and Moroccans to harden their policies and ironically united them in an informal coalition. The members of this alliance were completely unaware that they formed a coalition. They never negotiated its terms, and they formally never agreed to collaborate. If anything, after years of Algerian meddling in Moroccan politics, Algerians and Moroccans have perceived themselves as enemies. Moreover, they sold the same commodity and competed for the same buyers. And yet, despite being diametrically opposed in their goals, they shared a common interest, the control over merchants and direct commerce with captives with the orders of redemption. Whereas before Fatima's conversion, Spanish, Algerian, and Moroccan rulers perceived local ransomers and redeeming friars as complementary options, now they actively pursue the ransom agendas, which had up to that point remained only vaguely articulated. Moroccans, and especially Algerians, employed all available methods to prevent merchants from interfering in the ransom market. The Fatima affair then re-signified the relations between merchants and the friars. Now, redemption via the order and ransom via merchants were perceived as two excluding alternatives. And let me conclude. In 1616, Fatima leaves her last mark in the archive when she marries a Christian in Calvi, in Corsica. The Trinitarians died in their prison cells in Algiers. The affair continued to haunt Spaniards, Algerians, and Moroccans for decades. In 1648, a former Spanish captive who established strong friendship ties with his Algerian captors had sent the latter letters with an Algerian envoy present in Madrid at the time. The ex-captive informed his Algerian acquaintances of his efforts to convince the king ministers to send the Trinitarians to Algiers. Despite the fact that ransom in Algiers would have been cheaper for the crown, he explained, decision makers in Madrid, fearing a new Monroe affair, preferred to send the friars to Tetuan and Saleh, to Morocco instead. The conjuration of the affair in 1648 within the context of Algerian lobbying to send more redemption expeditions to Algiers shows that the world of ransom was shaped not only by the Spaniards, but rather by the interaction among institutional and individual actors from all sides of the sea. My first argument was methodological. I claimed that ransom was an overdetermined practice that cannot be reduced to market exchange alone. The negotiations over the exchange of Fatima and the Trinitarians have shown the importance of religious mechanisms, conversion, and of social reciprocity in shaping interactions between the parties involved. This insight is significant insofar as it forces us to revise the historiography of the turn of the 17th century as a moment of modernization at the Mediterranean. Modernization which undid, supposedly, the good old Mediterranean we all knew of religious violence. Complicating this narrative doesn't only entail explicating the role of extra-economic forces, but also giving up on the related idea that North European bounded nation-states replaced local actors. Local actors continued to overlap, collaborate, and compete with one another, and polities such as Spain and Algiers, to some degree, emerged as a result of such struggles and negotiations. The study of the trafficking of humans engendered by piracy and corsairs, a phenomenon that ranged from the trivial to the spectacular, requires a shifting analytical frame that combines attention to different value regimes on various geopolitical and social scales. Shifting between scales allows us to reinsert Spain, and by extension Europe, into early modern Mediterranean history. Piracy, captivity, and ransom meant that European communities in the Mediterranean littoral were stretched between Europe and North Africa way before the 19th century, when waves of migration sent thousands of poor Italian, Corsicans, and Maltese to Algiers, Tunis, and Egypt. It also means that the paradigmatic other of Spain, Jews and Muslims, not only became in charge of the physical rescue and moral salvation of Spaniards, but also participated in processes of state formation. Insofar as captivity and ransom formed the main interface linking Spain, Morocco, and Algiers, their analysis is essential not only in order to counter an image of a 17th century declining Mediterranean dissolving into nation states, but also to understand how Europe itself was partly shaped by Mediterranean networks and political projects. Thanks.
I think there's plenty of time for questions if people want to ask questions. Catalina, is it okay if I just call you?
Yeah.
I know your name, I'll say it if I forgot your name. Blush.
Thank you, Daniel, for that fascinating talk. I've been aware of your work for a while, and it helped me think about the Caribbean and sort of analogous processes there. And so I guess I had two questions. One is, you talked about the captives themselves being mechanisms of communication.
Right.
And all that you lay out these fascinating, complicated, overlapping networks. But I noticed in the Caribbean too, that in the 18th century Caribbean, what I look at, captive exchange becomes a chance for contraband trade, that it becomes a trade network. And did you find the ransom expeditions are also sort of forging further trade pathways, or were you more focused on this argument about communication? Maybe I'll just hold the second question because that was a complicated one.
Wait, you asked that one and no problem. Maybe
I'll circle back. Yeah. So
million people.
Is that clear?
Yeah, I think so. So I mean, there's one question about communication networks and like say more about them, but the other was like if general trade was related to ransom networks. Or?
Yeah, if the ransom networks are also they make communication possible, are they also facilitating and intensifying trade networks?
Okay.
Or are they? I mean.
So first, yes. I mean, one argument that I'm making is that the political economy of ransom generated communication networks. Even if only 10 to 20% of all captives ended up returning home, the prospects of returning home was always there, and it was predicated upon communicating with them. And this is one huge difference between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, between slavery of sub-Saharan Africans in the Mediterranean and slavery of Christians and Muslims in the Mediterranean. It was relatively easy to send letters, to receive letters, to interact with them. And captives wrote a lot. They were encouraged to write by their masters. The same holds true to Muslim captives in North Africa, in Europe, in Spain. And there are several contexts in which we see captives write more. I mean, so one obvious context is sending information about their place of captivity and trying to engineer whatever is necessary to obtain ransom, if it's in exchange for another slave. So direct their family members to find that other slave, or commission someone to, like Fatima, to go on and actually ransom them. Another context is actually, so slaves also brought back home even when they knew that they will never go back home. And one such context, for example, in the case of Muslims enslaved in Spain, was when they were baptized by force, or when they saw instances of desecration of bodies of their friends by Christians. In such instances, they immediately would write home. Their king would go to the Pasha. The Pasha would write a warning to the Spanish king that if you want to amend the situation in Mallorca, let's say, captives from Mallorca would pay for that. So this is, I'm getting there, but this is one context in which communication networks and ransom networks generated what we might call diplomacy from below, based on the logic of challenge and riposte on a Mediterranean scale. Now, did it generate trade, more broadly trade? So general trade and trade of humans is so entangled that it's really hard for me to answer the question, because I mean, one constant debate in 17th century Spain is about the twin projects of ransoming Christians from the Maghreb and trading with the infidel. And these two are just like so connected on so many levels. On the one hand, the king constantly alludes to canon law prohibitions of trading with Muslims. At the same time, he constantly issues trading license to merchants to trade with the Maghreb. Trading licenses that force these merchants to spend some of their monies on ransoming captives. The Friars, I just presented them as non-economic actors, but obviously they were involved in economic transaction, exporting silver to North Africa, different kinds of goods. With all their piety and devoutness, whenever they were criticized for throwing American silver to the garbage, they immediately had the papers to prove that actually they were extremely efficient in economic terms. So it's really hard for me to say that one is predicated on the other, that one was generated by another. But I just want to say that about communication networks, that actually, I mean, I learned a lot about them from Caribbean scholarship.
So, thanks for a fantastic talk, and I'm going to follow up on this whole question Eleanor brings up in terms of thinking about both comparative histories, but also thinking about the concept of slavery, and especially in the Mediterranean, with the notion of Islam. When you briefly mentioned that there was a notion of bonding, I think right at the beginning of your talk.
Notion of bonding?
Bonding, or there was a term that you used.
That I said.
In notion of slavery.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about Sufism. I'm thinking about the master-disciple relationship, and scholars, subaltern studies, for instance, has argued, especially using the Cairo Genizah or texts, about a concept of slavery in the Indian Ocean that is very different from, let's say, the Black Atlantic in that sense. So I wonder if we think about the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean in terms of this Islamic realm and notions of power that are embedded within Islamic conceptions of slavery, and how we could think of a different way of imagining slavery. Of course, there is the political everyday history of bodies being created, but again, subaltern studies would try to think of a different conception of slavery, and I wonder if that can be pushed to think about the Mediterranean in that sense, given the Islamic context.
So I actually think it was just my misuse of bondage, and because I very much agree with you that slavery in the Mediterranean and the rest of the world is so different from American slavery. Or American slavery is so different from any other slavery, and it's not good, in a way it's not good to think with about slavery. And I mean, I would further push what you're suggesting. It's not only slavery in the Muslim world. Even slavery in Europe of Muslims was very different from the Black Atlantic. Because of the short distances, because of some protocols of socialization, of adoption, of becoming members in a monastery, conversion. I mean, I'm not denying race also played a role in Mediterranean slavery, but slavery was mostly a religious phenomenon in the Mediterranean, and not only there. So I'm very sympathetic with this argument. I don't go against it.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. I would just say really quickly that captives and slaves are certainly not conceived in this as the same thing in this context. In Islam, these are not abid. There's something very different. Anyway, I really like your idea of trying to unsettling the narrative of northern invasion, but I think you can take it, and maybe should take it a little further. One way to do that, and I wonder how it would change your argument, or if it would change your argument, you stick very, very close to the coasts here. And that makes it easy to talk about things like Moriscos and Sephardic Jews as being attached to Spain. If you go down, and that works for the Beyliks and the Deyliks in North Africa, Ottoman North Africa, it doesn't work in Morocco, right, where the Sultan and his authority is inland and down at Fez and in Marrakesh especially. And those captives who are held in Marrakesh, so anyone who is captured, any European who's captured at sea becomes the property of the state automatically, and then the Jews and perhaps Muslims who are helping to ransom this person are by definition employees of the state. They're the Tujar al-Sultan, they're the traders of the Sultan. So you don't have that division by saying it has to be a merchant or the state. They're one and the same, and they have to be Marrakesh. Right. And then just to two other things that might complicate things when you go and look deeper inland is, or one other thing is that a lot of these, maybe it happens on the coast too, but these Christians who are there for a long time, a lot of them end up converting to Islam just because it's a lot easier. So there's that to consider, and then what happened, the ransom price goes down. So actually, they didn't want them to convert.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot here. Just a quick note about the terms. So captive and slave in European languages are used interchangeably, and they refer to different aspects of the same social career or history of the same people. And you're right about the Arabic terms, abid and asil, one used only for sub-Saharan blacks, which it's very interesting. I only noticed it recently. They hardly ever mention the sources, Christian sources, and we know some about this kind of slavery and Mullah Ismail in Morocco. I think there is one book about it, but we really know very little about enslavement of blacks in North Africa throughout the centuries. Now, the other point was really interesting about the distinction between merchants and the state in Morocco is sort of like artificial or analytical. That's really interesting. I need to think about it more.
I think it's truer on the coast. I think when you get inland to where the Mahza is, It's not so true because these merchants work for the Mahsan in Ransom.
No, but to some degree, I think it holds true for the Moroccan coast. I mean, it depends also when and where. I mean, the first half, or when the Alawites take over and the state become much stronger. So that really changes the answer to that question. But it's a point I would like to think more about. So thank you for this. And conversion, yes. So conversion deflated the value of captives. For this reason, this is related to my new project. For this reason, this is partly the reason for which North Africa has plenty of churches, Christian churches that are stocked with beautiful Catholic material culture of sculptures and pictures and whatnot, with material religious objects circulating among captives because of collaboration between friars and local authorities that are interested to prevent the captives Christians. Not only for economic reasons, but also because they knew that, so there were expectations regarding religious privileges to slaves across the Mediterranean, and Algerians expected Spaniards not to baptize by force Muslim slaves, and in return, you might say, Christian slaves in North Africa enjoyed religious privileges, churches, burial spaces, etc.
Ethan shaking to him.
I was going to ask, I think, what is a more ignorant version of Emily's question about the state as an actor. Because when you brought in states, you brought them in as actors external to the process of privateering. And I don't know much about the Mediterranean, but when I think of privateers in the Atlantic context, I think of actors who have some direct ties to the state and privileges from the state, and certainly I know of some instances of, there's obviously small-scale privateering by more or less independent actors on the make, but there's also very large-scale privateering in the Mediterranean that's very much part of state and imperial projects. So I'm wondering how much it makes sense to keep the state as an actor who comes in at the end of the process, and how much this is all about a kind of state or imperial intercourse in the first place.
Right. It's a good point, and this is partly the result of giving a paper and trying to save time. Because one thing that I also suggested by the end is that Algiers or Spain are to some degree the result of the disagreement between local actors, and they emerge as supposedly unified entities through this very dynamic. So what is Algiers? Algiers is the Pasha or the Janissaries? Or the result of the dynamic between them and other actors and opposition to the Sultan, etc., etc., etc. So the state is definitely not an external actor. To the contrary, it emerges as a result of these disagreements and struggles. Privateering, large part of the privateering enterprise was a state enterprise. But statal actor could have stopped it whenever they wanted or reignite it, etc. Thanks.
Do you want to follow up on this? No, you got it, Tim.
So I'd like to just come at this topic from outside the field as a scholar of literature, which is what I am. And to the extent that I know anything about these contexts, if you look at literary representations of these practices, one of the major themes that emerges is questions of social difference, relationship between middle-class captives versus aristocratic captives, and so on and so forth. Aristocratic captives who become friends then with their captors and are released versus, or fantasies of wealth and poverty and so on and so forth. So is that simply the literary projection onto these kinds of exchanges, or in the work that you've done, is there also a discussion of difference between sort of different social classes and the ways in which they are or are not exchanged?
No, this is I think, this is a faithful representation. Captives were obviously divided by classes, by wealth, by what they could pay for their ransom. So this is very much there on the ground, and later it's also represented. I think there are fascinating questions about the relations between representations of captivity and captive practices, and the degree to which captive and renegades learn how to behave even before they were captured by reading Cervantine comedies, and which themselves were shaped by the experience of Cervantes and other in captivity. So there is a fascinating field of questions there. I mean, there are several practices that Cervantes write about. For example, writing letters of recommendation. Captives used to write letters of recommendation on behalf of other captives who converted to Islam, and either desired to return to Christianity or were afraid to be captured by European fleets, and then they would have to account for their conversion in the Latin case and in the Inquisition. So captives would write, so and so converted, but only by word, and deep in their heart, this is the language of the sources, remain Christian, proving it through good deeds, helping other Christians to escape. And this is, so first this is a scene that we see in comedies, but these letters, they are in the archive, they are there. It's a practice on the ground. It's a fascinating practice because going back to your question, it shows you that captives were afforded legal persona in some context. They were in the position of testifying for someone else's religiosity. Such letters were not only a representation of captivity. Studying them, I can play the inquisitorial game and try to guess if the person converted truly or not. That won't lead me anywhere. But if we look at this text, we see, again, the power that captives were given through the practice. The fact that such letters themselves served as an object exchange between renegades and captives in return for favors described as good works. The fact that in some cases the Inquisition wrote back to North Africa to authenticate the identity of the letter writer. Through that, going back to your question, through that the Inquisition participated in the shaping of social distinctions among captives in North Africa. Some were stronger professors who could insert their students into better schools. And yeah.
I have a question. Actually two questions. So one has to do with this. I following up on Ethan. I guess I don't quite understand the supply chain here. So the people the slaves the captives are captured by corsairs who receive or are given commissions by the Pasha or by the Sultan to pursue this kind of trade so that they then become. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that how it works? So then, how is it that the merchants, these intermediary merchants in places like Tetuan, can then get access to the markets if the Pasha owns the captives from the point of capture to the point of wherever they're stuck when they come back? How do the merchants get access to them if the Algerian Pasha prohibits the sale?
The Pasha doesn't own all the captives. He gets, actually it's the same in Europe and in North Africa. They get a cut of between 5 to 10% of whatever they plunder, or the number of people they. But individuals also own captives.
So these merchants would then go to places like Algiers and they would kind of put up a sign saying,
Yeah, or they would know people. Yeah.
I see. Okay, so then it becomes an entirely informal trade.
Yeah, so this is not. So that's one of the fascinating aspects of slavery. There, this is not. It's not exclusively a state project. You see it all over the place. There is a slave market, and the slave market is it's sort of like this is the place that captures the European imagination in narratives. The sale in the slave market where they were made to process like animals, but slaves were also exchanged in the crossroad or in little houses or in different forms of exchanges that not all of which were economic transactions. They were bequeathed, they were given as gifts, they were swapped. So it's not only a state business.
So can I go on just did the Spanish king then have an incentive to use these Tetuan intermediaries because then they didn't have to buy the Protestants? They could just buy.
Yeah, that's another aspect. That's another aspect of why it was better to work with them because they purchased the desire.
They were more efficient in a way.
Yes, absolutely.
Even if they had to pay more money, at least they got what they wanted, as opposed to the mercenaries.
Yes, but they were Jews and Muslims.
I see. Yeah. So so one last time. So it seems like conversion works like asymmetrically here. So that if you convert on the Christian side, you're taken out of this economy, but if you convert on the Muslim side, you just get a depreciated value. So conversions.
No, well,
first,
asymmetry is structured into the system, and the first place where you see it is on the level of the production of the sources. So we know different things about different sides, but no, I mean, so Muslims converting in.
So no, I mean, if a Christian converted to Islam,
Yes.
they would still be part of the market, but
No,
But at
I
a
mean,
lower-
no,
at a
it's
lower
complicated. No, I mean, they can be captured, but like the friars will never ransom them.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, they're not part of the market anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, Ignacio in the back.
I don't see how, or could you expand upon how this affects the Northern European thesis? Because it seemed to me in your answer to Elena's question that you were saying that this is separate from other mercantile activity. So this just seems to be like a sideshow.
To the contrary, it's linked in so many ways to this other mercantile activity. It's not separate from it.
Okay, well, could you expand on that?
Yes, so I mean, on the one hand, friars exported goods and bullion to North Africa to sell them there to get the money they needed to buy captives. On the other hand, merchants were obviously trading whatever goods that they traded. I mean, furs, wax, fish. So could you?
Well, I guess
So the northern the northern.
in your introduction, you 2 of your 3 points were related to the Northern European
Right.
thesis, but then that kind of disappeared from the body of your talk, and so I'm just asking you to expand upon
Yes.
how you see this refuting the Northern European.
So the Northern European thesis suggests that from the 1580s on, Dutch, English, and French took over trade in the Mediterranean. And that it became an economic world in a way that it wasn't before, because before it was an imperial world full of religious rivalry and amodern logics. So what I suggest is that local actors, local merchants continue to be extremely important there, that religious practices shaped value, conversion for example, that social obligation, either on the level of confession or the level of fraternities, also shape the market. And so this is my criticism, or call for qualifying the idea of the northern invasion. The northern invaded the Mediterranean in this period. I mean, you see them all over the place. I'm not denying their presence. I'm sort of like questioning what did it mean.
Yeah, just really quickly, what happened with Jewish captives? Was that always just a Jewish affair, and that Jews in another community would have to ransom them, or was it ever the case that European powers would want to ransom Jews from Europe who were captured in North Africa?
So I didn't see any Jewish captives maybe very few in the Spanish documentation. They appear in the Italian, societies for the redemption of captives. There is a Venetian one. The sources are still there, and they focus mostly on Jewish captives in Malta. The practices are very similar to the ones of the Christian world. Similarly, too, the community is allowed to send them Jewish religious artifacts, prayer shawls, Bibles, whatever they needed for religious practice. Jews emerge, so the Jews appear as merchants, and another aspect of this trade is that enslavement didn't only made individuals into slaves, but it also constituted Jews as Jews. And what do I mean by that? So Jews buying Muslim slaves, bringing them to Oran, Spanish colony in North Africa, to sell them. They can own Muslim slaves in Oran. There is a thriving Jewish community until 1669. They own slaves. They own Muslim slaves. If these slaves convert, the Jews are forced to sell them. When Christians own slaves that convert to Christianity, they don't have to sell them. Jews who own Christians in Tetuan, should these Christians convert to Islam, the Jews are forced to sell them. Muslims are recommended to sell them, but they don't have to. So owning and selling slaves also, it didn't only point at the commodity, but also shaped the sellers in this world where slavery was religious and not, or to a lesser degree, racial. Yeah. Yes.
I want to inject a little sociology into it too, and in the same way that we have to keep reminding ourselves of not making the present mistake of thinking there's some kind of separation of church and state or church and state power. We have to keep guarding against the idea that there's this clear line between family and commodity, or family and market. That in the same way that marriage and adoption and other kinds of relationships are all very financial in some way too. They're all seen as commodities, your progeny or your property. In the same way, you have to think of this relationship that sounds like we would just put it as a slave market or as a ransoming market. It's also a way of organizing your family and of understanding your familial relations too. But I know you sort of hinted at that several times. So that we don't want to make the mistake looking back at it and trying to see that gaining new relationships through ransoming is somehow so very, very different than gaining new relationships through marriages or adoptions or inheritances or trading.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to Sugal's point earlier about the model of slavery in the Mediterranean, of slavery in the Muslim world, about the possibility of adoption, of manumission, of becoming part of the master's household. So these are not only religious or social dynamics, they also have an economic aspect. I very much agree with that. But what I find less convincing is when scholars are suggesting that we need to think about the Algerian widow trying to swap her son with the son of a Moroccan widow as economic actors. They're just trying to save their sons. But I very much agree that this kind of social incorporation was also economic.
You spoke in your talk a lot about space and how to sort of reconfigure how we think about this region, but you didn't give as many time markers about change over time with the practice or frequency. And I did think that there has to be more of this happening when states are at war. Or does it not matter that much? Is this captive taking really unregulated by states making war on each other? And are there, how do you want us to think about the kind of rise and arc of this practice across time? Yeah.
Thank you. I'll answer it in two ways. The first would be more chronological, during the 16th century, the 16th century was the century of spectacular maritime battles in the Mediterranean. Lepanto is the most famous one. And in such battles, in the span of a few short hours, 10,000s of Muslim and Christian slaves would change hands, captured, released, enslaved, and whatnot. And the empires were politically very present in the Mediterranean. In 1581, the Spaniards and the Ottomans signed the truce. Politically speaking, the Spaniards turned their attention to Northern Europe and the Atlantic world. The Ottomans are still very much there, but politically they are more busy with the Safavids. This moment, which supposedly was you would assume that their goal was to be less involved in Mediterranean politics. This moment transformed the nature of captive taking because corsairs took over, and rather than thousands of slaves arriving in Algiers once a year or once in every few years, or several hundreds, you would get 2, 10, 20, several times a week. So it sort of it became part of the social structures of the daily part of a daily routine across the Mediterranean. So that was a constitutive moment of the system I'm talking about. The other thing is, I think, the other point is that we can distinguish. I'm talking about, I mentioned region formation, the degree to which practices and relations and connections become more dense or to the contrary, dissolve. And I think we can identify 3 corridors in the Western Mediterranean where these things are way more intensive. And one is between Atlantic Iberia and Atlantic Morocco. Another is between the Spanish Levant, so Valencia, Mallorca, Catalonia, and Algiers and Oran. And the third one is between Sicily, Malta, and Tunis. And in these sort of like corridors, everything happens more. Just trying to qualify a little bit arguments about space and this transformation.
Well, I think we should thank you for your